The fire didn't announce itself with flames. It arrived as pressure, the wind snapping hard enough to bend treetops, ash falling before smoke was visible, the radio cutting off mid-word, and the forest going unnaturally still as if bracing. Because in that moment he realized the fire was already behind them and ahead of them at the same time, moving faster than prediction, faster than maps, erasing trails, stealing oxygen, and forcing a decision that would seem reasonable now, survivable later, and unforgivable by the end. By the time they admitted they were in trouble, the fire had already made several decisions for them. The wind snapping sideways through the trees, ash drifting down like early snow, visibility collapsing in shallow pulses, and the map in Mark's hands no longer matching what his feet were standing on, because the trail they were following had narrowed, then broken, then simply stopped existing as if the forest itself had decided it was no longer useful. Tom slowed first, not stopping, just enough to force Mark to look back, his face tight, eyes scanning the canopy, listening instead of talking, because sound carried information now. The crackle wasn't close, but it wasn't distant either, and the wind was wrong, blowing uphill when it shouldn't, pushing heat into places that should have stayed safe for hours longer. The radio died without drama, no final warning, no clear signal of failure, just silence. And Mark tried again out of habit, tapping it, adjusting the dial, knowing it wouldn't matter, knowing that every second spent hoping for equipment was a second the fire would use better than they could. They moved faster, not running yet. Running wastes air and judgment, but fast enough that conversation fell apart into gestures and short words, the terrain sloping down into a cut thick with brush and deadfall. Exactly the kind of place fire loved, exactly the wrong place to hesitate, and when the wind surged again, hard enough to make the trees groan, they felt it at the same time, that shift in pressure that meant the fire had found a path. Mark saw flame then, brief, distant, a flicker threading through the understory, too low to panic about if this were a drill, too fast to ignore now. And Tom said something that didn't fully register, something about the clear cut to the east, old logging scars that might break the fuel line, might slow the spread, might give one of them space to breathe. They stopped arguing before an argument could start, because both of them understood what staying together meant in that moment. One route, one gamble, no backup. And splitting meant risk multiplied, but also possibility multiplied. Thin chances instead of a single heavy one. And Mark heard himself say he'd go right. Heard his voice sound steadier than he felt. Felt Tom's hand grip his shoulder once, firm, practical, already letting go. They separated quickly, not because they wanted to, but because waiting made the smoke thicker, the light dimmer, the ground hotter underfoot. And within seconds the forest closed between them. Trees swallowing sound, the fire crackle spreading sideways, echoing, impossible to place. And Mark realized, as he moved alone through choking air and falling ash, that survival here wouldn't be about speed or strength. It would be about choosing the least wrong direction over and over again, until there were no choices left to make. The clear cut wasn't clear anymore, not the way it existed on the map. Decades of regrowth had softened its edges, young pines packed too tightly, brush filling the gaps, but Mark pushed toward it anyway because open ground, even imperfect, meant fewer vertical flames, less heat trapped under canopy, and for the first 10 minutes it almost worked. The smoke thinning just enough for him to see 50 yards instead of 10, ash stinging his eyes, lungs burning with every breath he tried to keep shallow and controlled. Then the wind surged again, stronger than before. Not a steady push, but a violent shove, bending saplings flat, dragging smoke sideways, and with it came sound, a roar now, deeper, closer, fire no longer creeping but running, and Mark understood too late that the clear cut had become a corridor, fuel on both sides, wind aligned just right to turn it into a funnel. He slowed, forced himself to think. Panic wastes oxygen, panic lies. The ground here sloped up toward rock, exposed shelves where trees thinned naturally. If he could gain elevation, he might find bare stone, a place fire could pass around instead of through. But climbing meant effort. Effort meant breath, and breath was already a problem. Each inhale scraping raw. He heard something behind him then. Not a voice, not footsteps, just the sudden violent crack of a tree failing, followed by a rush of air so hot it felt solid, and instinct finally overruled discipline. He ran, stumbling over roots, hands tearing at branches, heart hammering hard enough to shake his vision, the smoke collapsing into darkness around him as embers began to fall, bright and fast, sticking to fabric, burning through before he could brush them away. The slope steepened, rocks breaking through soil, and Mark dropped to all fours, crawling now, fingers numb, knees screaming, every movement measured against the sound behind him, because fire had a rhythm, and it was gaining, and somewhere in the noise he thought he heard Tom's radio crackle. One burst of static, maybe nothing, maybe everything, and the not knowing cut deeper than fear. He reached the rock just as the wind shifted again, a brutal reversal, flames bending away from him at the last second, racing past instead of over, heat slamming his back like a wave, stealing breath completely, and Mark pressed himself flat against stone, face in dirt, mouth open but useless, waiting for pain that didn't come, seconds stretching, then easing, the roar sliding downhill, moving on, hunting something else. When he finally lifted his head, the world had changed. The forest below him was a moving wall of fire, the clear-cut gone, erased. And above him the ridge was closer than it had looked. Reachable, maybe survivable. But the air was thin and dirty, and the realization settled in slowly, heavy and unavoidable, that he had made it through only one decision, and there would be dozens more before this ended, each one narrower than the last. He didn't know where Tom was, didn't know if the radio sound had been real, didn't know if calling out would help or kill them both, and as he began to climb again, slower now, more careful, he understood the second terrible rule of the fire. Survival doesn't feel like victory. It feels like borrowing time you're not sure you can ever pay back. The ridge took longer than it should have, distance stretching in the smoke, depth perception failing. Mark climbing by feel more than sight, hands sliding over stone warmed by passing heat, lungs working harder for less air, because the fire had stripped oxygen from the slope below, and what remained tasted thin and metallic. Every breath a reminder that time was no longer measured in hours, but in how long his body could keep obeying. When he crested the ridge, there was no relief, only a different kind of danger. The wind stronger here, unobstructed, tearing at him, carrying embers that skipped across rock like insects. The forest on the far side not yet burning, but already doomed. Smoke rolling over it in heavy layers. And for the first time he saw how large the fire really was. Not a wall, but a system. Multiple fronts moving independently, merging, splitting, adapting faster than any plan. He crouched low, heart hammering, listening, hoping against reason for the radio to speak again, for Tom's voice to cut through the noise. But the only sound was the fire below and the wind above, and the silence between them felt deliberate, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath. Moving along the ridge was risky, exposed, but dropping down meant entering fuel again, and Mark chose the ridge because choice, any choice, felt better than stopping. His legs shaking now, muscles burning from the climb, dehydration creeping in quietly, stealing clarity before he could argue with it. He misjudged the ground a few steps later, shale giving way under his boot, his body sliding sideways before he could react. Skin tearing against rock, pain sharp and immediate, enough to steal a breath, and he lay there for a second too long, staring at the sky, watching ash drift past like slow rain, thinking absurdly that falling here, breaking something would end the decision-making, would simplify everything. He forced himself up, checked the damage quickly, bleeding but functional. No time to be careful, because the wind shifted again. Not violently this time, but subtly. And that was worse, the kind of shift that redirected heat uphill, that sent smoke spilling over the ridge toward him, visibility dropping to nothing in seconds. Mark moved blind now, counting steps, feeling for stable ground, aware that one wrong move could send him into the fire's path or over the wrong side of the ridge entirely. And somewhere in the thick gray, he heard a sound that made him stop cold. 3 short bursts of static. Unmistakable. Close. "Tom," he tried to say, but it came out as a rasp, and he didn't repeat it, because calling back might pull the fire toward sound, toward movement, toward him or toward Tom if Tom was still alive and moving somewhere below. He waited, crouched, muscles screaming, smoke burning his eyes, and when the static didn't come again, he made the hardest decision yet, to keep moving away from the sound, because survival sometimes meant walking in the opposite direction of hope. As night began to bleed into the smoke, turning everything darker, flatter, more deceptive, Mark understood the 3rd rule of the fire. It doesn't need to catch you to finish you, it only has to keep you moving until there's nowhere left to go. Night didn't arrive cleanly. It seeped in through the smoke, swallowing edges first, stealing depth, turning the ridge into a narrow strip of uncertainty where up and down lost meaning. And Mark moved slower now, not from choice, but from depletion. Legs heavy, hands clumsy, mouth dry enough that swallowing hurt. Every step negotiated like a contract his body was less willing to sign. The fire changed its voice after dark, losing the sharp crackle of the afternoon and gaining something deeper, heavier, a constant moving pressure that no longer sounded like flame, but like wind forced through a giant engine. And that terrified him more than the noise before, because it meant the fire was no longer reacting. It was sustaining itself, feeding, no longer dependent on gusts or slope alone. Smoke dropped into the low places, pooled there, and Mark realized the ridge was narrowing, forcing him downward whether he wanted it or not. The ground slanting into a saddle thick with brush, exactly where fire would funnel when it climbed again. And for the first time since this began, he felt the pull of stopping, of sitting down, of letting the shaking in his legs become still. He didn't sit. He tore fabric from his shirt, wrapped it around his bleeding arm without slowing. Pain now distant, abstract, less important than the math unfolding in his head. Wind direction, slope angle, fuel density, everything he had learned in classrooms suddenly crude and incomplete, because no training covered what to do when every option was wrong. The saddle opened briefly into a depression where the ground was bare, rock scraped thin by runoff, and Mark dropped into it, pressing himself low, using the last light to scrape a shallow trench with his hands, dirt under his nails, lungs burning from the effort. Because if the fire came through here, it would move fast, but it might pass over instead of through, might spare the ground for seconds, maybe minutes. The heat arrived before the flame. It pressed down like a weight, flattening him, air vanishing, ears ringing, and he forced himself to breathe shallow and slow, face against dirt, eyes closed, counting heartbeats, because counting was something he could still control. Embers raining down, sizzling against stone, against his back, against his legs, pain flaring then fading as nerves surrendered. Somewhere in the noise he heard a sound that didn't belong to the fire, a single human shout, distant, torn apart by wind, maybe Tom, maybe memory, and Mark nearly lifted his head, nearly broke cover, before instinct crushed the impulse, because movement here meant ignition. The fire passed like a train, loud, violent, indifferent, and when the pressure finally eased, when the air crept back enough to breathe, Mark lay still longer than necessary, afraid to trust the silence, afraid it was another pause before the next run. When he finally moved, the world was unrecognizable, landmarks gone, shadows wrong, the forest reduced to shapes and stumps and glowing lines. And as he pulled himself upright, swaying, alive by margins he couldn't explain, he understood the 4th rule of survival here. You don't escape the fire, you endure its absence, and there was no guarantee how long that absence would last. Dawn came slowly, diluted by smoke, a weak gray light that did not feel like morning so much as a pause, and Mark woke without realizing he had slept, body jerking upright in confusion. Muscles locked, mouth so dry his tongue felt swollen, the ground beneath him still warm in places, still breathing heat back into the air like a warning that the fire was not finished, only rearranging itself. He took stock without standing, because standing cost energy, and energy had become currency. His arms stiff and swollen where the fabric was tied. The bleeding slowed but not gone, his legs trembling when he shifted weight. A deeper ache settling into his right knee from the slide on the ridge. Not catastrophic, but enough to change his pace, enough to narrow his options without announcing itself loudly. The forest around him was unrecognizable. Trees reduced to blackened poles, brush erased, ash ankle-deep in places, and sound carried strangely now, too far in some directions, swallowed entirely in others, and for a long moment he just listened, hoping, dreading, waiting for any sign that someone else had made it through the night. "Tom," he called once, quietly, the word breaking apart in the air, and he didn't repeat it, because hope, spoken too often, turned into something heavier when it went unanswered. He began moving again, slower than before, angling downhill toward where he believed a seasonal creek cut through the drainage. Water meant relief, meant a line to follow, meant a chance to think beyond the next hour. But the slope was unstable now. Ash hiding holes, roots burned through, ground collapsing without warning, and twice he caught himself just before falling, heart racing, breath ragged. The smell changed as he descended, less sharp, more sour, and he realized he was moving into a pocket the fire had skipped, a temporary island of standing timber and thick smoke, dangerous in a different way, because unburned fuel meant the fire could return, could circle back when the wind decided to make another choice. He found the creek by sound first, a thin trickle, barely moving, but enough, and he dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain, drinking without thinking, water gritty with ash but cold and real. And for the first time since this began, his body eased slightly, just enough to remind him what relief felt like. That was when he saw the boot print, clearer than his own, pressed deep into damp soil, angled the wrong way for an escape route, heading upstream, and Mark stared at it longer than he should have, because it meant Tom might be alive, injured, disoriented, moving without knowing where safety was anymore. And the knowledge shifted everything, turned the creek from an exit into a question. Following meant burning daylight, risking another wind shift, risking becoming trapped again. But not following meant walking away with the certainty that if Tom died out there, it wouldn't be from fire alone. It would be from being alone. Mark stood there, water dripping from his chin, listening to the forest settle, feeling the weight of the choice press down harder than the heat ever had. And as he took his first step upstream, committing without knowing the cost, he understood the fifth rule. Survival doesn't end when the fire passes. It begins when you decide who you're willing to leave behind. The creek narrowed as he followed it upstream, the water slipping between blackened stones, quiet but persistent. And Mark moved with it, step by careful step, scanning the mud, the ash, the edges where footprints survived longest, because tracks told stories even when people could not. Depth revealing weight, spacing revealing injury, direction revealing intention. And the print he followed was uneven now, the right foot digging deeper, dragging slightly, a rhythm that made his chest tighten. Smoke still hung low in the trees, not thick enough to choke, but heavy enough to hide distance. And every few minutes Mark stopped, listening, because sound traveled strangely after a fire. Voices flattened, echoes lied, and twice he thought he heard movement ahead. Branches shifting, stones scraping, only to realize it was the creek adjusting itself around fallen debris. He called Tom's name once more, louder this time, controlled, not shouting, the word cutting through the quiet. And this time there was an answer, not a voice, but the sharp metallic click of a radio key pressed without strength, followed by a burst of static so close it made him flinch. "Stay where you are," Mark said, not knowing if Tom could hear him. not knowing if the radio still carried anything beyond noise, and he pushed forward faster than he should have, knee protesting, breath shortening, because now the math had changed, now delay carried a different cost. He found Tom in a shallow bend of the creek where the bank rose just enough to block wind, sitting with his back against a burned log, helmet off, face gray with ash and exhaustion, eyes open but unfocused. One leg stretched at an angle that wasn't natural, boots soaked dark with creek water, and when Tom tried to speak, only air came out. Mark dropped beside him without thinking, checked breathing first, then movement, the ankle clearly damaged, swelling already, unstable, the kind of injury that didn't end things quickly but made every hour harder than the last, and Tom's hand tightened weakly around Mark's sleeve. Not fear, not relief, just contact, proof. The radio had partially melted, casing warped, battery dying. Tom must have crawled after the fire passed, must have followed the creek instinctively, must have collapsed when pain and fatigue finally won. And Mark felt a surge of something close to anger. Not at Tom, not at the fire, but at how thin the margin had been, how close he had come to walking past this place forever. He cleaned and stabilized the injury as best he could with creek water, tore more fabric, splinted the ankle with dead branches and cord. Movements efficient but rough, because gentleness took time they didn't have. And when he finished, he sat back on his heels, breathing hard, looking at the terrain ahead. Carrying Tom was impossible, leaving him was worse, and waiting risked the fire circling back when the wind shifted again, because the forest was not done burning, only deciding where to burn next. Tom met his eyes then, focus returning briefly, and shook his head once, a small motion, deliberate, as if trying to make the decision easier, and Mark understood what he was being offered, a way out that required silence, acceptance, abandonment. He stood slowly, pain flaring, looked down the creek toward where he believed the drainage widened, where rescue crews would search first once the fire line stabilized, and the sixth rule settled in, heavy and unavoidable. Survival becomes most dangerous when it starts to look like sacrifice. And Mark said, quietly, firmly, "We're moving," even though he had no plan yet that didn't end with both of them paying for it. Moving together changed everything, pace collapsing to the speed of pain and balance, Mark half carrying, half guiding, Tom leaning into him with the quiet determination of someone who understood that staying conscious was now a task, not a state. And the creek that had felt like a line of hope an hour earlier became a corridor of doubt, twisting, narrowing, forcing decisions every few minutes that drained more than they saved. They stopped often, too often, not because they wanted to, but because stopping was the only way to keep going. Mark talking constantly now. Not encouragement, not plans, just narration, pointing out rocks, turns, the sound of water changing pitch. Anything to anchor Tom's attention, because silence invited sleep. And sleep here felt dangerously close to surrender. Mistakes crept in quietly. A wrong turn around a bend that led them into thicker timber. A moment where Mark misread the slope and had to backtrack, wasting precious strength. The realization that dehydration was returning faster than expected. Mouths dry again, hands shaking when they rested too long, and the thought surfaced uninvited that maybe Tom had been right earlier. Maybe stopping was the cleaner ending. Mark hated himself for thinking it. The smoke lifted briefly as the sun climbed, offering a view that should have helped, but instead revealed how little ground they had covered, how far the drainage still ran before it widened, before it met roads or crews or anything that resembled rescue, and the scale of it pressed down hard, turning every step into an argument with reality. Tom began to drift, words slowing, responses delayed, and Mark shook him gently each time, sharper now, urgency bleeding through control, because awareness was the last thing they could afford to lose. And when Tom finally spoke clearly again, it wasn't to ask for rest or water. It was to say Mark's name, once, carefully, followed by, "If I stop answering, don't stop moving." The sentence landed heavier than anything the fire had thrown at them. They reached a bend where the creek widened suddenly, shallow and slow, ash floating on the surface, and Mark felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly broke him. This was the place. This was where searchers would start once conditions allowed. This was where logic said they should wait, but logic had already failed them several times. And waiting meant exposure, meant cold when night returned, meant betting everything on someone else's timing. Mark hesitated, just long enough for doubt to claw back in, long enough to feel how close he was to choosing wrong again. He looked at Tom, really looked, saw the effort it took to stay present, saw the question forming that Tom didn't ask out loud, and Mark made the call, committing them to the open bank, committing to visibility over comfort, risk over certainty, because doing nothing felt like the most dangerous option of all. As they settled against the stones, Mark building a marker from what little remained intact, bright fabric, reflective scraps, anything that could catch a distant eye, he felt the weight of the seventh rule settle in, final and sharp. Survival stops being about endurance when the next mistake becomes irreversible. And as the afternoon stretched thin, quiet, uncertain, Mark realized they were no longer racing the fire, they were racing time itself. Moving together changed everything, pace collapsing to the speed of pain and balance, Mark half carrying, half guiding, Tom leaning into him with the quiet determination of someone who understood that staying conscious was now a task, not a state. And the creek that had felt like a line of hope an hour earlier became a corridor of doubt, twisting, narrowing, forcing decisions every few minutes that drained more than they saved. They stopped often, too often, not because they wanted to, but because stopping was the only way to keep going. Mark talking constantly now. Not encouragement, not plans, just narration, pointing out rocks, turns, the sound of water changing pitch. Anything to anchor Tom's attention, because silence invited sleep, and sleep here felt dangerously close to surrender. Mistakes crept in quietly. A wrong turn around a bend that led them into thicker timber, a moment where Mark misread the slope and had to backtrack, wasting precious strength. The realization that dehydration was returning faster than expected. Mouths dry again, hands shaking when they rested too long. And the thought surfaced uninvited that maybe Tom had been right earlier. Maybe stopping was the cleaner ending. Mark hated himself for thinking it. The smoke lifted briefly as the sun climbed, offering a view that should have helped, but instead revealed how little ground they had covered, how far the drainage still ran before it widened, before it met roads or crews or anything that resembled rescue. And the scale of it pressed down hard, turning every step into an argument with reality. Tom began to drift, words slowing, responses delayed. And Mark shook him gently each time, sharper now, urgency bleeding through control, because awareness was the last thing they could afford to lose. And when Tom finally spoke clearly again, it wasn't to ask for rest or water. It was to say Mark's name. Once, carefully, followed by, "If I stop answering, don't stop moving." The sentence landed heavier than anything the fire had thrown at them. They reached a bend where the creek widened suddenly, shallow and slow, ash floating on the surface, and Mark felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly broke him. This was the place. This was where searchers would start once conditions allowed. This was where logic said they should wait. But logic had already failed them several times. And waiting meant exposure, meant cold when night returned, meant betting everything on someone else's timing. Mark hesitated, just long enough for doubt to claw back in, long enough to feel how close he was to choosing wrong again. He looked at Tom, really looked, saw the effort it took to stay present, saw the question forming that Tom didn't ask out loud, and Mark made the call, committing them to the open bank. Committing to visibility over comfort, risk over certainty, because doing nothing felt like the most dangerous option of all. As they settled against the stones, Mark building a marker from what little remained intact, bright fabric, reflective scraps, anything that could catch a distant eye, he felt the weight of the seventh rule settle in, final and sharp. Survival stops being about endurance when the next mistake becomes irreversible. And as the afternoon stretched thin, quiet, uncertain, Mark realized they were no longer racing the fire. They were racing time itself. Night returned without ceremony, sliding in behind the smoke, flattening the world into sound and temperature, and Mark felt the margin narrow again, the way it always did when light disappeared, when distance became guesswork and time lost its edges, and he tightened his focus to the small circle that still belonged to him. Tom's breathing, the creek's steady whisper, the faint warmth trapped in stone. Cold settled in layers, first on skin, then deeper, a slow insistence that made stillness expensive, and Mark fought it with motion he could afford, shifting weight, rubbing hands together, keeping Tom engaged with questions that required answers longer than a nod, counting responses, spacing them, because drift was easier now, and easier still to miss. The wind changed sometime after midnight, not abruptly, not loudly, but enough to move the smoke, enough to open a window above them, and through it came sound again, distant at first, then nearer, a rotor's uneven chop, tentative, searching, disappearing and returning as if uncertain where to commit. And Mark stood, swayed, forced his arms up, signaling with everything reflective he had left. The aircraft did not land. It hovered far enough away to be safe, close enough to promise nothing, and a voice crackled through a loudspeaker, words torn apart by wind and distance, directions Mark could not fully hear, but he understood the meaning anyway. Hold position, stay visible, conditions unstable, we'll try again. Hope landed hard, then splintered into work. Mark built a perimeter of signals, brighter, wider, anchoring fabric to branches, stones, anything that wouldn't lift in the wind, his hands clumsy now, coordination thinning, but purpose keeping him upright. Because this was the hinge, this was where survival tipped one way or the other based on minutes, not miles. Tom squeezed his arm once, brief, deliberate, a gesture that said enough, and Mark nodded, because there was nothing left to explain, only to endure. The helicopter pulled back, engine noise fading into a shape the dark could swallow, and Mark sat again, conserving heat, conserving thought, repeating the plan silently so it wouldn't unravel. Stay awake, stay visible, stay here, and the simplicity of it felt heavier than anything before, because it offered no distractions, no movement, no illusion of progress. Sometime before dawn, fatigue surged like a tide, vision blurring at the edges, the urge to close his eyes arriving with a convincing argument. Just a moment, just enough to reset, and Mark answered it by standing again, by speaking Tom's name, by pressing his back to cold stone until the shock cut through the fog. When the sound returned the third time, closer, steadier, committed, Mark did not rush it, did not wave wildly. He held position, controlled, because he understood now that rescue was not a rescue until it touched ground, until it chose them over the fire, over the wind, over every other risk competing for attention. As the night thinned toward gray, the aircraft circled lower. The light cut through smoke in a clean white line, and Mark felt the story narrowing to its final pages. Not resolved yet, not safe yet, but shaped. And he understood the last rule before the end. You survive long enough to be found, and then you survive long enough to believe it's real. Morning arrived as a color shift more than a sunrise, gray thinning into something pale and uncertain, smoke lifting just enough to reveal movement in the air above them. The helicopter returning with intent this time, not circling wide but committing, dropping lower despite the wind that still tugged at it, despite the fire lines that smoldered in the distance like reminders that nothing here was finished. Mark stood when the downdraft hit, grit and ash driven sideways, eyes watering, balance wavering. But he stayed upright, signaling steadily, because sudden movements invited mistakes, and mistakes were no longer negotiable. Not now, not this close. And when the aircraft settled into a hover just above the creek bank, the noise overwhelming, the world shrinking to vibration and force, he felt something inside him finally loosen. The crew moved fast, disciplined, voices calm but urgent, gestures sharp and practiced, one of them touching Tom's shoulder, another guiding Mark back when instinct pushed him forward too quickly, and Mark realized how close he was to collapsing, how thin the line had been between control and failure, and how little strength remained once permission to stop finally appeared. They lifted Tom first, careful, precise, and Mark watched the distance open between them for a brief moment, panic flaring until a hand caught his arm, grounding him, pulling him toward the aircraft, and as his boots left the ground, the forest dropped away, burned and broken, a pattern of black and gray that made the scale of it impossible to deny. From the air, the fire looked different, less like a predator and more like a system, vast, indifferent, still moving, still consuming, and Mark felt the strange weight of knowing he had been inside that system, measured by it, nearly erased by it, and yet somehow released. Inside the helicopter, noise softened into a constant hum. The crew focused, efficient, Tom conscious but quiet, eyes open, and Mark sat back against the frame, hands finally still, realizing his body had been trembling for hours without him noticing, the delayed cost of every decision arriving all at once. As they pulled away, smoke closing beneath them, Mark felt no triumph, no surge of victory, only a deep, steady exhaustion and something heavier, an awareness that survival did not end with rescue, that the fire would continue without them, that the choices made out there would return later in memory, quieter but persistent. When the forest finally disappeared behind them and the helicopter turned toward clear air, Mark closed his eyes for the first time since the ridge. Not to escape, not to rest, but to mark the moment, because he understood the last rule clearly now. You don't survive to forget. You survive to remember exactly how close it came, and that knowledge, more than the fire, would stay with him long after the smoke was gone. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.